a discussion we often have that we do when we're in person. So I'm going to set a little bit of an expectation for us, that my hope is that what you'll take away from our 6 hours together is a clear determination and understanding of how this topic is not something over here by itself, race unity in America, or the most vital and challenging issue, but how it is front and center in everything that we're doing in relationship to the community building activities and the framework for action that the House of Justice has given us. In the past, you know, when we've had times in our nation where the issue of race has risen to the public mind, you know, I don't want to speak for my Black friends, but I will say that in the conversations that I've been having with some of my friends this last month or so, a common comment is, yeah, we've seen this happen before. Everybody gets so excited and then it fades away and we go back to the same old, same old. So that may not actually happen now at this moment in American history. It reminds me, these days remind me very much of the 60s when I was young and a Baha'i, and we were seizing the opportunity for the receptivity that actually the civil rights movement was arousing in everyone. So we may not be going back to the same old, but it's also seductive for us to get pulled over and think of this as, because the Guardian designated this topic, the freedom from racial prejudice, as the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'i community and the American nation, that we should segregate it from everything else. And so my goal is for us all to see and find a way in which it is completely intertwined and cohesive with the work that we're doing. And I'll just share a little bit. When the Regional Council met at our last weekend meeting now 3 weeks ago, we basically scrapped our agenda and spent the entire weekend just studying these selected passages, extracts from the letters written on behalf of the House of Justice to individuals in the United States. And we were reading it through the lens of what is the implication of the work of the Regional Council. When we study it together as a council, whatever we study, it's always through that lens, because we're an institution that has a responsibility, a specific responsibility given to us. When local assemblies study this document, which I hope they do and that they'll give adequate attention to, obviously their lens is going to have to be, what is the implication for the work of a local spiritual assembly? When individuals study it, we're going to study it through the lens of what is the responsibility of the individual that's implied here in these words of guidance. So the council spent an entire weekend, that is from morning through night on Saturday and then morning through late afternoon on Sunday, and we weren't finished. And we then ended up spending another hour and a half on our evening meeting the next week in order to just get to the point where we could begin to articulate a few learning questions, a few objects of learning that we needed to explore. And so I will say then, therefore, that 6 hours is not going to be adequate. So we're going to do kind of a broad brushstroke, and I'm hoping that it will give you enough to continue on your own with your communities, with your families, with your, if you serve on a local assembly, if you serve on the area teaching committee, if you however and whatever you do. A couple of observations. In the Northwest, as you know, the majority population is white. That does not mean that we don't have thousands of people of color living here in the Northwest. In most places in the Northwest, they are not the obvious population unless you look. And if you recall, a couple years ago, the Regional Council wrote to every local assembly asking them to look at their census data to see who lives in their town, basically. And we knew that when you did that, you would see that while, yes, in most cases, the majority population is white, there were large enough populations of both Black people, American Indians, and certainly immigrants in every town to raise your eyebrows and possibly suggest things to you. So I'll just share in the council meeting, we were talking in Elahi, who lives in Medford, Oregon, relatively small town, very white. She said, you know, we just don't really have much diversity here. And so we said, well, let's look at the census data. And lo and behold, in that white town where it doesn't appear that there's much diversity, there are 600 Black people living in that town. And the moment that we saw, that Elahi saw that, she says, okay, well, then I need to go to the schools and find their parents. Because clearly, just because they're not running in my circle doesn't mean that they're not there. And so that's an example of how looking at all of that we're doing through the lens of race unity can help us all be more mindful. It occurs to me that when we think about who we're inviting to our devotional gatherings, every invitation that you make is a choice that you make. And if you don't know people from the wider society who represent the underserved populations, you might say, or that rising group of people who will actually be the ones that are going to take us into the golden age through their vision in their experience, then, you know, we're all going to have to make the effort to find the way in which we can reach out to people that may not be the obvious ones that live next door to us or that are in our workplaces. So those are a couple of just introductory comments that to kind of start your creative juices going, because wherever you live, there are people who we hope will be our friends, who we need to have joining our circle in greater and greater numbers. Because in the end, the solution for race unity, or the overcoming of racial prejudice, is an interracial fellowship. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, isn't it? That's what Abdu'l-Baha said, an interracial fellowship. And an interracial fellowship is formed when we are friends with people. So with that opening, I'm hoping you all now have downloaded the documents and that you have them available. I'm going to try not to share my screen when we look at the documents, which is why I want you to all have your own copies, because when you share the screen, you can't see anybody. But if you'll look at the extracts from letters written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice to individual believers in the United States on the topic of achieving race unity, which is the updated compilation, it includes even a letter from March 2020. We're gonna read the first one of those, and then we're gonna go to the next the other document, the Abdu'l-Baha on race unity, just to kind of orient you. Is there someone who has it in front of them? Dave Gregory, I see that you have it in front of you. Would you be willing to read the first selection, which is the very first one, and it ends, it's basically 3 paragraphs. You see it? It's got a number 1 at the very bottom in the House of Justice ones.
It ends with number 1 or starts with number 1?
It ends with number 1. They
Okay.
number these passages by putting the number of the passage at the bottom. So it starts out, it's the very first one. The Universal House of Justice is received and read.
Okay.
Go for it.
The Universal House of Justice has received and read with interest your letter dated 10 December 1995, seeking its guidance in regards to the work of achieving race unity in the United States. We have been instructed to send the following reply. Since the writings contain so much material on this subject, already brilliantly summarized and expounded by the beloved guardian, the House of Justice does not feel it would be feasible or useful to rehearse that with which you are already very well familiar. The friends, generally, need to digest this material, to study and internalize it until they have a profound grasp of the Baha'i perspective on the matters which you have identified as ones on which there is no true unity of thought. For this, mastery of the teachings, there is no effective substitute.
Would you read that last sentence again?
The friends generally,
Yeah.
the last, okay, for this mastery of the teachings, there is no effective substitute.
Yeah, so the mastery of the teachings refers to the sentence right above that. I'll read that one again. The friends generally need to digest this material, to study and internalize it until they have a profound grasp of the Baha'i perspective on these matters, which that writer has identified on which there is no true unity of thought. So for the Baha'is to have unity of thought, there is no effective substitute than mastery. So you have 19 pages of guidance from the House of Justice in your hands. I put together another 18 pages of some of what Abdu'l-Baha has said about this subject. You know, of course, and quoted in this document from the House of Justice includes the specifics from Advent of Divine Justice, where the Guardian specifically gives us instruction about freedom from racial prejudice. So I'm hoping that that our 6 hours together will arouse in you a deep and profound desire to master this subject. Because as you know, in the May 9th letter from the House of Justice that just came out this year, May 9th, 2020, one of the things they said, that this was the letter about responding to the pandemic. And one of the things they said there was Baha'is need to have clear voices to contribute to thought in the wider society. A Baha'i does not have a clear voice if they haven't mastered and digested these topics. So I don't mean to go on and on, but I just wanted to highlight that piece before we move on. Okay, so Dave, would you continue then? Because then in this next paragraph, the House of Justice reminds us about things at the level of principle.
In essence, the House of Justice feels that methods should be subordinated to purposes and goals and are to be selected, adapted, or discarded as they show themselves to be effective or not. In this regard, it has often been observed that attempts which set out self-consciously to arrive at unity often lose momentum unless they lead beyond discussion to some form of action. With respect to principles, it will assist the Friends greatly if the issue of addressing race unity can be formulated within the broad context of the social development of the community. The distinctiveness of the Baha'i approach to many issues needs to be sharpened. In our public outreach, we need to correlate the teachings with current thought and be very clear about the bases and assumptions upon which various conceptions rest, and not swallow uncritically whatever ideas happen to be in vogue. Likewise, as a community, we need to be future-oriented, to have a clear vision and to think through the steps necessary to bring it to fruition. This is where consultation with the Baha'i institutions will provide a critical impulse to your own efforts.
So you might want to sort of set as a goal for yourself some things as we go through the material that might help you clarify and make a distinction between those ideas that happen to be in vogue at any given moment and the crystal clear statements and assumptions from the writings. Also, note the date of this letter. It's February 1996. It's the month before, 2 months before the House of Justice launched us on our 25-year journey of advancing the process of entry by troops, which finishes this coming Rizwan in April 2021. So the House of Justice is responding to an individual who said, what about race unity? And heralding really in this letter, which before they launch the one-year plan and start us off on a path of building training institutes and understanding the value of devotional gatherings, and then gradually unfolding the concept of children's classes and junior youth spiritual empowerment programs and getting study circles up and running, and then beginning a process of advancing. We didn't even have clusters in February of 1996. And so the House is really, if you think about it historically, they are heralding the intertwining of this most vital and challenging issue with a plan they haven't even shared with us yet, that they knew was in the offing because it was unveiled in April. It began in April. So actually, you know, we had a sneak peek at it because they had written a letter to the to the counselors, the Conference of the Counselors, in December, right before this letter. And so if we were looking over their shoulders, which in those days we weren't so much because we didn't realize that was a planned message yet. I mean, you know, we were just beginning this process of advancing the process of entry by troops. And in that, so set against that backdrop, we have this letter from the House of Justice that puts things at the high level of principle. So are there comments or questions that people have before we move on? I can't see all the slides, but anybody? All right, I hope it's helpful to have this historical perspective. Okay, well, if you'll now turn to the Abdu'l-Baha on race unity and race unity document, the other one, the other long one, which you have either on your screens or you've printed out. I'm wondering, Vic, are you up for reading? Okay, so I'm going to read the first quote at the top, and then Vic, I'd like you to read the first number one, which is a relatively long one. It's a very interesting historical piece, which describes history, which for many Black people, they're aware of, the race riot that happened in Springfield, Illinois. Hopefully we will all, as we're gaining some understanding of Black history in the US, we'll all become aware of it. This one was written and posted on the 239 days website that followed every single day of Abdu'l-Baha's visit in 2012. It was a retrospective, and this is adapted from that website, which I give you at the bottom. So I'll read this first quote, which is, I think, very helpful for us to think about. When a person becomes a Baha'i, this is Abdu'l-Baha, I'm sorry, this is Shoghi Effendi. He gives up the past only in the sense that he is part of this new and living faith of God, and must seek to pattern himself in act and thought along the lines laid down by Baha'u'llah. The fact that he is by origin a Jew, that would be me, or a Christian, a Black man, or a white man, is not important anymore. But as you say, lends color and charm to the Baha'i community in that it demonstrates unity in diversity. So now we're going to look at an early moment in the time of Abdu'l-Baha's visit and the events that led up to the formation of the NAACP, and then the nexus between the faith and that and the NAACP that grew out of actually those race riots, and what happened when Abdu'l-Baha came to this country. Okay.
Would it be helpful to read that footnote first?
Yes, it would be very helpful. Thank you. So down at the bottom of the page, you'll see a footnote that describes why uses of terms like Negro and colored are used by Abdu'l-Baha and by Shoghi Effendi in the context. Yes, so please read it. Thank you.
A note about the various terms to describe people of African descent in the time of Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. Colored was the preferred term for Black Americans until W.E.B. Du Bois, following the lead of Booker T. Washington, advocated for a switch to Negro in the 1920s. Du Bois also used Black in his writings, but it wasn't his term of choice. Despite claims that Negro was a white-coined word intended to marginalize Black people, Du Bois argued that the term was etymologically and phonetically preferable to colored, or, quotes, various hyphenated circumlocutions, end quote. Most importantly, the new terminology, chosen by Black leaders themselves, symbolized a rising tide of Black intellectual, artistic, and political assertiveness. After achieving the shift in vocabulary, Dubois spearheaded a letter-writing campaign to capitalize his preferred term. In 1930, the New York Times style book made the change.
Yeah, so it'll be helpful for you to remember that you have this little note, because this is often, sometimes what term we use to describe people of various backgrounds and colors become politically correct, and then they fall out of favor, and then something else becomes politically correct, and then they fall out of favor. And we all have to remember that race is actually just a construct. It's not an actual thing, but it is a thing because we suffer from still the effects of racial prejudice and the effects that have had on our whole culture here in this country. Okay, go for it, Vic. This is a very interesting historical thing.
The race riot in Springfield, Illinois, on August 14, 1908, changed forever the public agenda for colored people in the United States of America. Beginning early in the evening, a mob of several thousand white Springfield citizens proceeded hour after hour and on 2 days in succession, to make deadly assaults on every Negro they could lay their hands on, to sack and plunder their houses and stores, and to burn and murder on favorable occasion. William English Walling, who wrote the account, and his wife arrived in Springfield the next morning. He registered his shock in an article in the Independent on September 3rd. We at once discovered, to our amazement, he wrote, that Springfield had no shame. She stood for the action of the mob. I talked to many of them the day after the massacre and found no difference of opinion in the question why the came to think they were as good as we were was the final justification offered, not once, but a dozen times. And I skipped what I hope is an obvious thing that's lined out here.
Mm-hmm.
Before the Springfield race riot, most Americans had believed that large-scale race violence was a purely Southern phenomenon, confined to backwaters like Atlanta or Wilmington or North Carolina. In fact, there had been several anti-black confrontations in the North, but the Springfield riot shocked and disgraced the nation because it had occurred just 4 city blocks from Abraham Lincoln's home. Springfield galvanized, at last, the national movement for Negro rights. Soon Walling, who was a socialist, and several white friends founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a nationwide biracial organization that would fight to achieve African American civil rights for the next 50 years. Many years later, Walling shared his own version of this history. I always date the real launching of the organization, he wrote, from the day we secured Dr. Dubois. W.E.B. Dubois resigned his teaching position at Atlanta University to become the NAACP's publicity director and editor of The Crisis, the organization's official publication. 3.5 years later, the NAACP invited Abdu'l-Baha to address their 4th annual conference in Chicago. He spoke at the conference twice, on Tuesday, April 30th, 1912, once early in the afternoon at Hull House in South Chicago, and then to the evening session at Handel Hall at 40 East Randolph Street in the Loop neighborhood. Dubois had named Abdu'l-Baha one of the Crisis's Men of the Month for May. Almost immediately across the road from Handel Hall at the Masonic Temple at 29 East Randolph Street, another convention was underway that evening. 58 delegates from 43 cities were about to elect 9 members to the governing board of the Baha'i Temple Unity, a national body formed to coordinate the largest project ever undertaken by the Baha'is in North America, the construction of an enormous house of worship north of Chicago. White fluted columns with capitals wrapped in acanthus leaves surrounded the delegates in Corinthian Hall as they cast their secret ballots. After the first round of voting, there was a tie for 9th place between Frederick Nutt, a white doctor from Chicago, and Louis Gregory, the black lawyer from Washington, D.C. In a dramatic departure from the vicious 1912 presidential election which raged all around them, each man resigned in favor of the other. Then Mr. Roy Wilhelm, a delegate from Ithaca, New York, stood and put forward a proposal. His motion, seconded by Dr. Homer S. Harper of Minneapolis, recommended that the convention accept Dr. Nutt's resignation. The delegates responded unanimously, and Louis Gregory became the 9th member. To have elected an African American to the governing board of a national organization of largely middle and upper class white Americans, and to have done so at the nadir of the Jim Crow era in 1912 was rare in the extreme. Even the NAACP had only elected 1 black member to its executive committee when it had been formed in 1909. Later that evening, Abdu'l-Baha gave a public address to conclude the 4th annual convention of the Baha'i Temple Unity. The next day, he laid the cornerstone for the Baha'i House of Worship. After the stone was in place, Abdu'l-Baha said, "The temple is already built."
Thank you. And thank you, Nikisha, for putting this together, because that's way beyond my skill set. Thank you, Nikisha. That was great.
You're welcome. You're welcome, everyone. Just want to let you know, if you're going to be talking about this, the Black American community calls this man W.E.B. Du Bois. We use the whole name, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Thank you.
If anyone else knows anything else about that, please feel free to share.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I went back and forth because I was like, okay, should we use the French pronunciation then next? And then I realized, he belongs to the Black African American community. And therefore, we need to use the pronunciation that they have been accustomed to, and probably was the way he pronounced his own name, right, Nikisha? Because we all pronounce things, I have a French name and I don't pronounce it French in the French style. I pronounce it pronouncing the T at the end. And yeah, did you want to say more, Nikisha?
No.
Okay. My guess is that probably that was the way he pronounced his name, or it wouldn't have come down in history as how we are pronouncing it now when we're thinking about it historically. So friends, how exciting is that our Baha'i lives are intertwined from the Jim Crow era in this very intimate way. W.E. Du Bois chose Abdu'l-Baha as one of his men of the month in this Crisis magazine for the May issue. And before that, in April, Abdu'l-Baha spoke twice to the NAACP. And they were having their convention at the same time our national convention was happening across the street from one another. How cool is that? Yeah. Any other comments? Does anybody else know anything more about the history or want to share something?
Wouldn't that be the 9th day of Rizwan too? April 30th, 19.
Yeah.
9th day of Rizwan.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty significant as well.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So let's now take a look at one of Abdu'l-Baha's, at his talk that he gave at that NAACP convention. And it is on page 4 of the document of Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity. It's number 6. And it's just, it's number 6. And so at the bottom of page 4. And Nakme, are you someone who enjoys reading? Go for it. Would you like to read this? And now this is an excerpt from the talk. Go for it. Okay, unmute yourself so we can actually hear what you're saying. Wait.
Hold on a second. Let me actually scroll down here.
Okay, it's on the bottom of page 4.
I have to go between documents. So you're talking about going back to the House of Justice page again?
No,
Correct?
I'm talking about the same Abdu'l-Baha document.
Okay.
Just page 4 of that one. It's number 6.
Number
The talk
6.
at the 4th annual conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Handel Hall. So this is one of the talks that we read the story about.
So on the bottom of page 6, did you say?
On the bottom of page 4, it's excerpt number 6.
Got it. I'll start. Do you want me to read the whole thing?
Yes, please. Or
Okay.
maybe as we can share back and forth if that works for you, if you have our voices.
Sure. Talk at the 4th annual conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Handel Hall, Chicago, Illinois. Let us now discover more specifically how he is the image and likeness of God, and what is the standard or criterion by which he can be measured and estimated. This standard can be no other than the divine virtues which are revealed in him. Therefore, every man imbued with divine qualities who reflects heavenly moralities and perfections, whose expression of ideal and praiseworthy attributes is verily in the image and likeness of God. If a man possesses wealth, can we call him in an image and likeness of God? Or is human honor and notoriety the criterion of divine nearness? Can we apply the tests of racial color and say the man of a certain hue, white, black, brown, yellow, red, is the true image of his creator? We must conclude that color is not the standard and estimate of judgment, and that it is of no importance, for color is accidental in nature. The spirit and intelligence of man is essential, and that is the manifestation of divine virtues, the merciful bestowals of God, the eternal life and baptism through the Holy Spirit. Therefore, be it known that color or race is of no importance. He who is the image and likeness of God, who is the manifestation and bestowal of God, is acceptable at the threshold of God. Whether his color be white, black, or brown, it matters not. Man is not man simply because of bodily attributes. The standard divine measure and judgment is his intelligence and spirit.
Therefore, let this be the only criterion and estimate. For this is the image and likeness of God. A man's heart may be pure and white, though his outer skin be black, or his heart may be dark and sinful, though his racial color is white. The character and purity of the heart is of all importance. The heart illumined by the light of God is nearest and dearest to God. And inasmuch as God has endowed man with such favor that he is called the image of God, this is truly a supreme perfection of attainment, a divine station which is not to be sacrificed by the mere accident of color. In Washington, too, we called a meeting of the blacks and whites. The attendance was very large, the blacks predominating. At our second gathering, this was reversed. But at the third meeting, we were unable to say which color predominated. These meetings were a great practical lesson upon the unity of colors and the races in the Baha'i teaching. God maketh no distinction between the white and the black. If the hearts are pure, both are acceptable unto him. God is no respecter of persons on account of either color or race. All colors are acceptable to him, be they white, black, or yellow, inasmuch as all were created in the image of God. We must bring ourselves to realize that all embody divine possibilities. If you go into a garden and find all the flowers alike in form, species, and color, the effect is wearisome to the eye. The garden is more beautiful when the flowers are many colored and different. The variety lends charm and adornment. In a flock of doves, some are white, some black, red, blue, yet they make no distinction among themselves. All are doves, no matter what the color.
This variety in forms and colorings, which is manifest in all kingdoms, is according to creative wisdom and has a divine purpose. Nevertheless, whether the creatures be alike or all different should not be the cause of strife and quarreling among them. Especially, why should man find cause for discord in the color or race of his fellow creature? No educated or illumined mind would allow this differentiation and discord should exist, or that there is any ground for it. Therefore, the whites should be just and kind to the blacks, who in turn should reflect an equal measure of appreciation and gratitude. Then will the world become as one great garden of flowering humanity, variegated and multicolored, rivaling each other only in the virtues and graces which are spiritual.
Thank you. When you read through the rest of these quotes from Abdu'l-Baha, you'll see that this was his theme. There's no difference between black or white. Animals don't pay any attention to what color the sheep is or the doves or the this or the that. Why would we care about that? It's all about the quality of a person's soul and has nothing to do with their color. So, you know, this is what Abdu'l-Baha concentrated on in his visit in 1912. It was always basically the same theme. But as you noticed in the message from the Universal House of Justice that we first read, that Dave read, they basically said, if we just talk about this and there's no action, it doesn't lead to anything. So I also want to weave through our 6 hours together, some looking at what Abdu'l-Baha did, because he wasn't just all talk, even though he was talking to the NAACP or he was talking to this big congregation or that big meeting as he was moving, you know, around the country and giving these illuminating talks, which we can read in Promulgation of Universal Peace. He was also doing things. So if you can scroll through your document, or if you printed it off, turn to page 8. I referred to, but I also want to now just read it again, at least a portion. I would assume, because I'm looking at screens of mostly people that I know have been Baha'is for a long time, and maybe there's some that are relatively new, so I'm not going to make the assumption that every one of you is familiar. But if you look at the very top of this page 8, it's called Examples of Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity. The first quote there is from a longer passage in The Advent of Divine Justice, starting on page 34, that describes what the Baha'is need to do in order to become free from racial prejudice. And that's where Shoghi Effendi calls it the most vital and challenging issue facing the American Baha'i community and the American society. In there in that longer passage, which the House of Justice refers to in some of its messages, and we'll look at in another session, the Guardian actually outlines what Black people should do, what white people should do, what none of them should do, and what all of them should do. So there are things we do together, there are things that we should completely avoid, and there are things that that both white people have to do, which is different from what the Black people have to do. And the Guardian outlines all of that in that section in Advent of Divine Justice. So this is the second paragraph of that that's at the top of here, and I'll read that one. And then we're going to read a couple of examples. And then we'll use this document with the examples interspersed with the guidance about race unity, so that you can see the action of Abdu'l-Baha along with what the teachings tell us to do. And hopefully that will ignite in us a vision of our own action and what it might look like. So that's really the purpose of it. And it's because of this particular paragraph from Advent of Divine Justice that I have put together this compilation. And I would ask any of you, if you know of stories that are not in here, I would love it if you would send them to me so that I can expand this compilation. And that means, of course, you'd have to read through the whole thing. But I'm sure there are more, because as much as a researcher as I am, or every researcher knows that there's an inexhaustible supply of material and gems hidden and tucked away here and there. Okay, so I'll read this first quote. Let them call to mind, this is Shoghi Effendi speaking to the American Baha'is in 1938, Christmas Day, 1938. Let them call to mind, fearlessly and determinedly, the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha while in their midst. Let them remember his courage, his genuine love, his informal and indiscriminating fellowship, his contempt for and impatience of criticism, tempered by his tact and wisdom. Let them revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable and historic episodes and occasions on which he so strikingly demonstrated his keen sense of justice, his spontaneous sympathy for the downtrodden, his ever-abiding sense of the oneness of the human race, his overflowing love for its members, and his displeasure with those who dared to thwart his wishes, to deride his methods, to change his principles, or to nullify his acts. This paragraph gave rise to the compilation of stories that is now follows, because Shoghi Effendi says, let them revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable and historic episodes and occasions on which he so strikingly demonstrated his keen sense of justice, his spontaneous sympathy for the downtrodden, his ever-abiding sense of the oneness of the human race, his overflowing love for its members, and his displeasure with those who dared to flout his wishes, to deride his methods, to challenge his principles, or to nullify his acts. So that's why we are going to be taking this wonderful look at some of the stories that Abdu'l-Baha, of how Abdu'l-Baha actually acted while he was among us. So the first one is Abdu'l-Baha's own report. And Stefan, I wonder if you'd be willing to read this one, number 11, and then maybe if I could have a volunteer then for the next one, the Black Rose story. But let's read this one first. This is Abdu'l-Baha's own reporting. Mm-hmm.
Calling to mind Abdu'l-Baha while in our midst. When the Blessed Perfection became the head of the family, my grandfather had many colored maids and servants. When the Blessed Perfection became the head of the family, he liberated all of them and gave them permission to leave or stay. But if they desired to remain, it would, of course, be in a different manner. However, all of them, reveling in their newfound freedom, preferred to leave, except Esfandiar, who remained in household and continued to serve us with proverbial faithfulness and chastity.
So here Abdu'l-Baha is describing that Baha'u'llah himself, the moment he became head of the family, freed their servants. And as you know, he, of course, called for the freedom of slaves worldwide, and praised countries that had done that. Okay, so is there someone who'd like to read the Black Rose story? I don't know who amongst you all are people who love to read. Okay, go for it. Vic, did I see your hand, or Cassia? Did I see yours? Yeah? Did you raise your hand?
Happy to.
Okay, please, that's good. Let's have a woman's voice.
Towards the latter part of April, late on Sunday afternoon, I was again at the home where so many wonderful hours had been spent. It had become almost a habit, when the service at my church was over and dinner dispatched, to hasten into New York and spend the rest of the day and evening at this home.
Can I just interrupt you for just a moment, Cassia? For those of you who are not familiar, this is actually taken from Portals to Freedom, written by my great-grandfather, Howard Colby Ives. And so you know this, some of you will know this story, but this is its source. And we're going to revisit it again because it's one of those examples of Abdu'l-Baha in our midst. Okay, thank you, Cassia.
I was standing alone at one of the windows looking out upon the street when I was startled by seeing a large group of boys come rushing up the steps. There seemed 20 or 30 of them, and they were not what one would call representatives. I'm sorry, the cat. And they were, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing it. Okay, there seemed 20 or 30 of them, and they were not what one would call representative of the cultured class. In fact, they were a noisy and not too well-dressed lot of urchins, but spruce and clean as if for an event. They came up the steps with a stamping of feet and loud talk, and I heard them being ushered in and up the stairs. I turned to Mrs. Kinney, who was standing near. "What is the meaning of all this?" I asked. "Oh, this is really the most surprising thing," she exclaimed. "I asked them to come today, but I hardly expected that they would." It seemed that a few days before, Abdu'l-Baha had gone to the Bowery Mission to speak to several hundred of New York's wretched poor. As usual, with him went a large group of the Persian and American friends, and it made a unique spectacle at this party of Orientals in flowing robes and strange headgear as this party of Orientals in flowering robes and strange headgear made its way through the East Side. Not unnaturally, a number of boys gathered in their train, and soon they became a little too vocal in their expression. As I remember, even some venturesome ones called names and threw sticks. As my hostess told the story, she said, "I could not bear to hear Abdu'l-Baha so treated, and dropped behind the others for a moment to speak to them. In a few words, I told them who he was, and that he was a very holy man who had spent many years in exile and prison because of his love for truth and for men, and that now he was on his way to speak to the poor men at the Bowery Mission. Can't we go too?" One who seemed to be the leader asked. "I think that would be impossible," she told them, "but if you come to my home next Sunday," and she gave them the address, "I will arrange for you to see him." So here they were. We followed them up the stairs and into Abdu'l-Baha's own room. I was just in time to see the last half dozen of the group entering the room. Abdu'l-Baha was standing at the door, and he greeted each boy as he came in, sometimes with a hand clasp, sometimes with an arm around a shoulder, but always with such smiles and laughter it almost seemed that he was a boy with them. Certainly there was no suggestion of stiffness on their part or awkwardness in the unaccustomed surroundings. Among the last to enter the room was a colored lad of about 13 years. He was quite dark, and being the only boy of his race among them, he evidently feared that he might not be welcome. When Abdu'l-Baha saw him, his face lightened up with a heavenly smile. He raised his hand with a gesture of princely welcome and exclaimed in a loud voice, so that none could fail to hear, that here was a black rose. The room fell into instant silence. The black face became illumined with a happiness and a love hardly of this world. The other boys looked at him with new eyes. I venture to say that he had been called a black many things, but never before a black rose. This significant incident had given the whole occasion a new complexion. The atmosphere of the room seemed now charged with subtle vibrations felt by every soul. The boys, while losing nothing of their ease and simplicity, were graver and more intent upon Abdu'l-Baha, and I caught them glancing again and again at the colored boy with the very thoughtful eyes. To the few of the friends in the room, the scene brought visions of the new world in which every soul would be recognized and treated as a child of God. I thought, what would happen to New York if these boys could carry away such a keen remembrance of this experience that throughout their lives, whenever they encountered any representatives of the many races and colors to be found in that great city, they would think of them and treat them as different colored flowers in the garden of God. The freedom from just this one prejudice in the minds and hearts of this score or more of souls would unquestionably bring happiness and freedom from rancor to thousands of hearts. How simple and easy to be kind, I thought, and how hardly we learn. When his visitors had arrived, Abdu'l-Baha had sent out for some candy, and now it appeared a great 5-pound box of expensive mixed chocolates. It was unwrapped, and Abdu'l-Baha walked with it around the circle of boys, dipping his hands into the box and placing a large handful in the hands of each, with a word and smile for everyone. When he returned to the table at which he had been sitting and laying down the box, which now had only a few pieces in it, he picked from it a long chocolate nougat. It was very black. He looked at it a moment, and then around at the group of boys who were watching him intently and expectantly. Without a word, he walked across the room to where the colored boy was sitting, and still without speaking, but with a humorously piercing glance that swept the group, laid the chocolate again against the black cheek. His face was radiant as he laid his arm around the shoulder of the boy, and that radiance seemed to fill the room. No words were necessary to convey his meaning, and there could be no doubt that all the boys caught it. You see, he seemed to say that he is not only a black flower, but also a black sweet. You eat black chocolate and find them good. Perhaps you would find this black brother of yours good also, if you once tasted sweetness. Again, that odd hush fell upon the room. Again, the boys all looked with real wonder at the colored boy as if they had never seen him before, which indeed was true. And as for the boy himself, upon whom all eyes were now fixed, he seemed perfectly unconscious of all but Abdu'l-Baha. Upon him, his eyes were fastened with an adoring, blissful look, such as I had never seen upon any face. For the moment, he was transformed. The reality of his being had been brought to the surface, and the angel he really was revealed.
So this is one of the best known stories that we have of Abdu'l-Baha, because Howard Colby was so generous in sharing events that he was observant to. I'm wondering if there are some thoughts that you might have. You know, we can use the chat box. If there are thoughts that you have about what you see in this story that are kind of universal principles. So for instance, Abdu'l-Baha greeted every boy, but he gave a special greeting to this black boy, as he arrived, put his arm around him, and he called him a black rose. Are there other things that you notice in this story that are kind of a principle that you're thinking about and going, huh, what would it look like if I did, if I was doing something like that, what would it look like? If you happen to be with a group of kids and there was one black child, do you see a suggestion of your own, of something you could do that would be similar? And why did it work? Why did this boy not seem embarrassed? What was it about Abdu'l-Baha's method? What was it about Abdu'l-Baha that created an environment where this boy was not embarrassed, or, but he was able to take it in? And what was it about how Abdu'l-Baha created an environment because of his own quality of love that also won the respect of the rest of the boys, so that they actually looked at their brother with new eyes? So there's some kind of deep questions. And if if you want to think about it a little bit and just post your comments in the chat, we can all kind of see, maybe a little easier. If there's anyone that wants to share out loud, that's fine too. It's a little hard to see with two screens to try and keep on top of it.
I'd like to share out loud.
Okay.
I just, before writing or thinking about what happened in the actual meeting, is that there was a prior relationship with these boys. These boys already knew what he hadn't reacted when they had been following and chasing, and some of them throwing sticks, calling names. Instead, they had been invited. They already knew that he had suffered and been imprisoned for many years. So they had already been greeted warmly coming into his home, or into a home where he was staying. So there was a lot of prior subtle relationship building that had gone on before anything happened in the group.
So the Baha'is were a team.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that their ears were open to him by the relationship that he had already created through his example and his actions in their view.
Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Kinney was the one who dropped back and spoke to them and told them who he was and that he'd been in prison and all that kind of stuff. And she was the one who greeted them at the door as well. That's what I meant when I said the Baha'is were a team. Abdu'l-Baha was way up ahead of the procession, and so they didn't actually interact with him on the street. But Mrs. Kinney dropped back, and so she was already well enough schooled by Abdu'l-Baha not to drop back and scold them. She could have just chased them away in protecting Abdu'l-Baha, right? So he had already prepared the Baha'i community to the point where they knew to act with love towards these street urchins. And so in a loving way, she shared with them who he was. Anything else that people see in this story?
I'd like to share, if I may.
Yeah, please. Yeah, Jonna, hi.
Hi. I don't have a good answer to your question, how, yet, but I have a question to the answer, why. Why we do that, or why I do that, is just simply because that's the guidance. That's what Shoghi Effendi and Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah have requested that we do. That, when Native Americans are present, that we see them as our spiritual leader. And, when people of color are present, that we, I'll have to paraphrase, but Shoghi Effendi's quote that, use 100 times more, it's not tact, but a word like that, 100 times more tact. And that it is a special circumstance, and we do need to regard that as very, I guess special is the best word to use. And I guess I feel that keenly just because, where I live is so, it's not very diverse yet. And I've never really lived in a place that was very diverse. So I guess I'm answering why I do that. I just simply do that because that's what I've been asked to do. And I've been asked to look at it that way. So I try to do that just out of obedience. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Jana. Anybody else that has something that they wanted to add to this? What the story, how the story is educating you?
If no one else has something to say, I have a little bit to say.
Yes, please go for it, Keisha.
Not every, but most Black people in the United States, wherever they are going to have that slandered word. You know, they're going to have that attack. Someone's going to call them the N-word, and to go into a place, to go into a space where people see the color of your skin and appreciate it, gives some, it's heartwarming. It's heartwarming to people. And acknowledging that I see you in this way, and I believe that it's beautiful, you know, sincerely. It really says a lot. It does a lot for Black people. We are people with big hearts and very peaceful and very aware of things that happen and aware of things that do not happen. So Abdu'l-Baha and so many of these vignettes, these stories of him and his experiences in the United States, he made sure things did happen, didn't let things pass by. He made it very, very clear what he wanted, where he wanted them to be in the presence, and what a beautiful person each one was. And it got to the heart of the person, got to the heart of the Black person, and that love just flowed, and then everyone else felt that love, and it just created a loving environment, you know. And they kind of saw past the prejudice, and they were able to move to humanity, to seeing people as human.
Thank you. Any others that are thinking about this story and what its implications might be in your life? Or
there was one thing that struck me was that he didn't just treat the boys equally. Like, he acknowledged that there was something special both in this Black person, but also in doing so acknowledged that his experience with those other boys was different. It wasn't a colorblind action. He went out of his way to acknowledge that.
yeah. What I noticed in this story is that Abdu'l-Baha's generosity of love, greeting every boy either with a, you know, arm around the shoulder, a hand clasp, a pat on the shoulder. Every boy was greeted individually and lovingly as they came in, and they seated themselves. He did single out this black rose for special comment, loud enough for the whole group to see. So he set the agenda right away by identifying this special person in the room. Then his generosity of love manifested itself in handfuls of chocolate. And you notice he bought a 5-pound box and he scooped out big handfuls into the hands of these boys. So there was a generosity of spirit that was expressed also in the generosity of the sweets that he was handing out. He didn't just give one. You know how sometimes you're in a group of kids, you say, okay, pick one, only take one, got to make sure there's enough for everybody. Well, Abdu'l-Baha made sure he had a big box. And so they were all already being bountifully given something that they were not usually given, and in a generous way in which they were given. And they were eating their chocolates when he then thoughtfully picked up this chocolate nougat. So they're tasting the sweetness of the chocolate. He builds quite a whole system there, doesn't he? Of creating an environment in the space with those people of love, of a generosity of spirit, and then makes his final point with the black chocolate. Yeah, Mary Beth?
I think one thing that's really important to remember too, and I see this in my classroom all the time, how important it is to place in a position of honor the child of color. That often in society, we don't realize how subtly whites are always placed in a position of honor, whether they're allowed to speak first or their voices are heard more often, or whatever the case may be, that when you recognize and honor that child of color, you're doing something that doesn't always happen in larger society. And how critical that is, whether it's, you know, just, I think about my classroom, which is, you know, we talk about our society isn't very diverse, but if you go into the classrooms, the children in our society are very diverse, that there's a lot more diversity in our communities than we realize. And when I go into my classroom and there's Native American children and there's Marshallese children and there's Black children and there's white children as well, that when you start honoring, you honor everybody, but you honor especially those children of color and what their talents are or what their spirit is, in a non-superficial way, in a very deep way, that changes the whole dynamic of thought for the classroom as a whole. And when we start doing that, we start changing the dynamic of thought for a society as a whole. And I think that's one of the things that Abdul Baha was doing in a very outward way that allowed everybody to see the importance of honoring that child. And I think that that's something that we need to do, especially with children in this society right now.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anyone else that has a comment?
Yeah, I'd just like to share a short couple of anecdotes. Jolie and I are with the Pullman Senior Center, and about a year ago, I guess, a tall, thin Black woman came looking around, and she's new in town, and she wanted to know, you know, what it was all about. And we hit it off very easily, and talked throughout the lunch and that sort of thing. And as we were leaving, I did something I've never done before. I hugged a strange woman, and you know, I just reached out, and it was a very natural thing to do, to hug her, and she hugged me back, and we've become very good friends, Jolie and Terry and I. But the larger point I want to make is this. Well, another short anecdote. I was at the supermarket the other day. We had our face masks on, and there was a young Black woman standing next to us as we were moving into the store. And I looked her in the eye and smiled. Now, I'm sure she couldn't see my smile, but I made eye contact with her and nodded. That's all I did. But this is the kind of thing we can do to recognize the humanity of whoever we see. People of color, you know, anything we see. And I think as Baha'is, we often tend to be a little bit more sensitive to people who are downtrodden. If we look to their eyes, we can see this. And if we can smile without our masks on, unfortunately. But the point is to make contact that recognizes their humanity. And I think this is so important. And it really doesn't matter the color of their skin or their age. You do this with a child. Child will light up because they're not used to adults smiling at them and kind of, even as ugly as I am, you know, it doesn't frighten them most of the time. And I think that this has just happened to be something we don't have to play tricks or try to put something in our minds which is somewhat artificial, even though we are well-intentioned. Simply by recognizing our fellow human beings as fellow human beings and loving them, letting the love that we feel in that case shine out and they see it.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else? Okay, go for it.
I just want to acknowledge that also. I mean, as a Black man, I would say, you know, we're on an everyday basis, you know, we just seek to have that commonness, just that sense of humanity. And oftentimes we don't get that. We don't get people looking in our eyes. We don't get people acknowledging us as people. And so small gestures, I know everybody speaks about large, grandiose gestures, but you know, even the small, enduring, honest ones, they make a difference. And so I applaud those efforts when people go out of their way just to make me feel like a human being, make me feel acknowledged, make me feel as though I'm a part of society that for so long I haven't made to feel as though I'm a part of. And so if nothing else, I just want to amplify what was just said. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, so you see the wisdom of Abdu'l-Baha asking us to go back and look at what Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi going back and asking us to look at what Abdu'l-Baha, what he did while he was in our midst, because although circumstances, it's 100 years since he was here, still it's the same basic thing that he was saying and showing us that now has to come into play. So a couple more things before we have about 15 minutes left. If you go back now, I'm sorry we have to keep switching documents, go back to the House of Justice document. So this is the extracts from letters written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice, the one that Dave read from at the very beginning. I want to share with you a little bit of an insight that the Regional Council came to, because we read the second one, so it starts on the bottom of page 1, and I'll read this paragraph. This is specifically in answer to a question that Baha'i had written, also written in 1996, by the way, April of 1996, right before Rizwan. A Baha'i had written about what to do to ameliorate the plight of American Black males, African-American males. So they say, with regard to the question of what public role, notice the word public role, might be played by the Baha'i faith in America to ameliorate in the immediately foreseeable future the plight of African-American males, the size and influence of the Baha'i community are, alas, too limited for it to have a determining impact on the conditions which have, after all, been hundreds of years in the making. And I have to say, when the council read this together, several of us commented that that seemed very discouraging, that the size and influence of the Baha'i community. And then they go on and talk about why it's been so long in the making and why it's going to take some time. But then they remind us at the very bottom of that page, the obstacles are not of such character that, for example, legal reforms could dissolve them. So put that away in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the conversations you're having now with regard to how we need to advance. The House doesn't say legal reforms won't help. They're saying legal reforms won't dissolve the baleful influence of racism. But then they say this is not a council of despair. So we read this first paragraph and we went, oh my gosh, that's so discouraging. And then the House says, no, this is not a council of despair, nor is it an equivocation or a suggestion that the requirements of divine justice ought to be deferred. Nor is it to say that Baha'is have no critical role to play. On the contrary, the concern is with Baha'i fundamentals, with looking deeply into underlying causes and identifying strategic lines of action which make the wisest use of our limited resources at this point in the development of the Baha'i community. And then I want you now to go to the very end of the document, this House of Justice document. So almost 25 years later, 24 years later, the Universal House of Justice writes, and we'll look at this letter later in another session in more detail, but I want you to read we're going to read the very last because it will give you a historical picture of where we were at the beginning of this 25-year-long period, and now where the House of Justice says we are. And it starts with the paragraph, actually, we'll start with the paragraph on the bottom of page 18. Dave, since you were the reader of the House of Justice message before, have you found it? Would you like to read that one for us? Dave Gregory? Bottom of page 18, thus there is no dichotomy. This just gives you the context of the part that I'm wanting you all to hear.
Thus, there was no dichotomy between the Guardian's earlier guidance on race and the focus of the teaching plans that constituted his subsequent stages of the execution of the divine plan. The same holds true today. The House of Justice does not wish to detract one iota from the profundity and importance with which Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi have invested the issue of the elimination of racial prejudice. At the same time, the faith has grown in size and capacity, and the circumstances surrounding the issue of race in the United States continue to mutate into new malignant forms. The American Baha'i community is no longer, quote, incapable of producing any marked effect on the great mass of their countrymen, unquote. Through their efforts—
Wait, stop. Read that again with your announcer voice. The American Baha'i community. Just that
the
last
American Baha'i community is no longer, quote, incapable of producing any marked effect on the great mass of their countrymen, unquote.
Okay, wait, we're just gonna stop for a minute. 25 years ago, we were too small and we couldn't really do anything to mitigate. And now the House of Justice said on March 4th, the pandemic was just dawning on us. We hadn't yet, George Floyd was still alive. And the House of Justice says the American Baha'i community is no longer incapable of producing any marked effect on the great mass of their countrymen. How amazing is this statement? Okay, so now you can read the rest of it, Dave. I just wanted to highlight this for us.
Put greater emphasis on the syllables, yes.
Yes, right.
Through their efforts to understand and apply the teachings about race, unity, and freedom from prejudice in the context of the current series of plans, will they propel themselves along the path to the time anticipated by Shoghi Effendi in the advent of divine justice, quote, when they will be called upon to eradicate in their turn such evil tendencies from the lives and the hearts of the entire body of their fellow citizens.
So friends, in the 24 years since the House of Justice began to have this dialogue with various individuals in the US, who began, in many cases, some of these individuals were quite alarmed as we began to build the Training Institute process and began to cluster and began to have core activities. And it seemed like all that mattered was children's classes and junior youth groups and devotional gatherings and study circles. Some friends wrote to the House of Justice over the course of this 20-some years, 24 years, saying, but what about the most vital and challenging issue? And we'll go back, we'll look at some more of these letters in upcoming sessions, but we saw an evolution, and I just wanted to frame that for you. From 96 until now, the House of Justice went from saying we're too small to make a difference to now we can, we have enough. And I want to remind you that in some places in the world where the Baha'is have carried out the framework for action of the plan of the House of Justice, they have now changed culture where they live. So if you remember, in the film called A Widening Embrace, it came out in 2018, so at the International Convention. In Widening Embrace, there is a scene in one of the island countries. It starts out, there's a woman telling you how many junior youth live on that island, in that population. I think it was about 3,500. It could have been 3,700, I forget. The Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program had engaged more than half of that population and had transformed these kids. And then there was a man that comes on, and he's the governor or the, whoever the political head of the island. And he says that population, those junior youth, used to run wild in the community and terrorized the population. But now, thanks to this program, the jails have emptied out, and these junior youth are now contributors to the advancement of civilization in their country. So that's one example that comes to mind. I would recommend to you that if it's been a couple of years since you watched A Widening Embrace, that you go back and watch it again, because it shows you the example of how it is that Baha'is are making the change at the level of culture as we engage with more and more people in our own population. Some of you have had the opportunity to study material that the counselors put together for us that we were supposed to be having teaching conferences about in May. And that process has changed a little bit, and it's rolling out in a much smaller way, mostly through Zoom. In the Northwest, we call that material Expanding the Community at the Grassroots. And you may have seen it. It's got, the logo has a bunch of what look like little thumbprints in different colors and circles. And in that material, one of the things we talk about is looking at ourselves as expanding nuclei. That every group of Baha'is, every team of Baha'is, whether it's a couple, whether it's a group of friends that serve together, that have a devotional gathering, whether it's some children's class teachers and the families that they're working with, they constitute a nucleus of friends. If you think about this need to view everything through the lens of race unity and the role that we can play in expanding the widening the effect of race unity, you can see that if we're thoughtful about who we include in these core activities, we will be able to contribute now significantly to the change of culture. So Mary Beth, you were talking about the effect you can have as a teacher in a classroom. The same thing is true in a junior youth program. The same thing is true in a children's class. The same thing is true in a devotional gathering, especially if you're mindful about who you invite and how you begin to establish a devotional gathering that reflects the culture of the diverse population that you happen to live amongst. And all of these activities, because they're small, a junior youth group is hopefully no more than about 20 kids. If you get more than that, you want to have 2 groups because there has to be an intimacy. Every one of the things that the House of Justice has asked us to begin, these core activities, they're intimate. They're intimate groups. They're intimate groups of people who spend a regular amount of time with one another, either in their devotions, their study circle, their junior youth groups, their children's classes, and they involve families. Ultimately, they involve families. And so you can see how these expanding nuclei, if we're thoughtful about it, will actually begin to put down roots of a culture of an interracial fellowship, which leads to interracial unity. Because in the end, the bottom line is what Abdu'l-Baha did. Really loving people. They felt loved, and they were then therefore empowered. And as Abdu'l-Baha said, they were truly his friends. Whether they were the poor people he visited in the Bowery, whether they were this African-American boy, this black boy that he called the Black Rose, whether it was Louis Gregory, and next week or tomorrow we're going to read the story about Mr. Gregory and the luncheon. All of that really was because of a relationship. It's about love and about relationships with people. And so I'm hoping that as we move through the rest of this material, your fertile brains will start thinking about, what does this look like in the core activities that I'm hosting, or with the friendships that I'm making, like Pete was saying, this friendship that he's formed with the woman who came into the senior center, and now he and Jolie have a wonderful friendship with her. If his Baha'i heart had not prompted him to greet this woman, would they have that friendship, which I'm sure they by now really value? Nod your heads, Haugs. I know you really value this friendship. I've heard you tell this story, right? Yeah, you would not have that friendship, and you wouldn't have the vision that you get because you're seeing through the eyes of someone who has a whole different experience. That's true for Larry too, and all of the friends that I'm looking at. Nikisha and I, we somehow or another we've been spending a lot of time on the phone together, and actually even in person. And I'm so grateful to have the ability to look through her eyes as well. So Nikisha, I see your hand is up, and we're going to now come back and let you probably make the closing remarks. So.
Thank you. I don't know if this is going to be a closing remark. I just wanted to make a point for having this loving gathering here. It's my first time at Sheltering Branch, and I thank Nakme and her family for always inviting me. I think they would have made me go had we not had COVID. They would have taken me there. I'm hearing the conversation, and it's reminding me of what happens in the community at large when we start talking about Black people and the upliftment of Black people, or what's happening in the Black community. Everybody wants to put their isms in there, and then all of a sudden, the Black people are erased. So, I just wanted to note that when we remove the term Black people or African Americans or whatever we're referring to us as, and put instead other terms, sometimes what happens is you're making your own self superior, and then everybody else is other. For example, people of color. We're talking about Black people, but people of color is a different group. And when you say people of color, you mean I am the dominant, and then there are the others. So when we're thinking about these messages from the Universal House of Justice, National Spiritual Assembly, looking at the stories of Abdu'l-Baha when he was in America, keep in mind that it was specific to Black people. We have a very unique history that allows us to be who we are as spiritual beings, because we were enslaved in such a way with everything. Our minds were enslaved and made to adopt Christianity, but look what we've done to it. We've made it ours, and our faith has grown so much, and it's really deepened us, because if we had not embraced it, what would have happened? Either we would have been killed, or even worse, our loved ones. We would have watched our loved ones be tortured and killed, like burned alive. And so we've adopted this and made this our own. And so we have this spiritual power. That's why they have that compilation on constructive resilience that was referred to the Baha'is of Iran, but they asked us to refer, when we look at it, think about the Black people, because we're the spiritual descendants of those enslaved people, and we also have to use that constructive resilience to move throughout our world. And it's okay. It's okay to say Black or African American or what you're going to use, but let it be like Abdu'l-Baha did. Let it be known that this is the one you're referring to, and this is how I see you. And I'm not mixing you up with anyone else, because you are you, and you are special, and you have a special place here, and not water it down with mixing us up with other folks. And we all know, yes, that we're all the flowers of one garden. We're the leaves of one tree, and we are one. We are one. And when we go out to teach the faith, we also have to familiarize with the people that we're teaching. So even though we're a one, we're diverse. and we have to acknowledge the diversity. And sometimes that means, like the gentleman was saying, he's gotten to know that lady that he hugged, and gotten to know her in such a way that she's quite unique, and he will find out so much about her life and her culture. And we don't always have to seek out Black people. You know, they are there actually. But when we, just like when you buy a car and you never see that car anywhere, but when you buy that car, you obviously see that car all over the place. Right? So when you have your mindset to teach or to embrace Black folks, you'll find them. We're there. Yeah, I think that's it right now.
Well, I knew they would be the closing remarks. Thank you, Keisha. And we're right at 11 o'clock. We're actually a couple minutes past. So we're ending this session. And we will see you again tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock for the devotions. By then they'll have them sorted out, and then 9:30 for this session. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Erica.
Love you all.
Aloha, friends.
Love to everyone. Great to see your faces and hear your
guys.
voices.
Bye. Aloha. Bye, Amanda. Aloha, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Aloha.